We're now here at the Walpeup site, which is part of the MSF Amelioration Costs project, and we're looking at tine spacing interaction and the forces and the loosened area of those different settings. So this pit we're looking at here is sort of like the standard setup. So we're using Tilco tines and we're operating at 600 millimeters deep. The tine spacing here is 600 millimeters, so the tine spacing is 1 times the depth of work, which is pretty common setting. And as you can see, without a wing on the tine, those tines have loosened their sort of upside down triangle to the surface, and there's been some interaction between these tines, probably to about 350, 400 millimeters. So about half their working depth they've interacted, but as you can see at the full working depth they're not interacting with each other, so there's a proportion of the soil there that's not been loosened and not been decompacted, so we'll stay in that physically constrained state. So the interesting thing here is when we compare this with different tine spacings and see the difference in the amount of interaction between the tines. Okay, so now if we compare it with this pit, which is the same Tilco tine working at 600 millimeters deep, but this time we've spaced the tines at 1.5 times the working depth, so we're up to 850 approximately there for spacing on the toolbar. So now we can see that tine working at that depth without a wing. We're really not getting very much interaction between those two tines, so they're almost behaving as if they're independent tines. Yeah, and very little interaction between those two tines, so there's no opportunity for root exploration into that centre area where the physical constraint hasn't been removed. What we'll do now is we'll go and have a look at the winged alternative, where we've got the standard 1 times depth spacing and 1.5 times depth spacing to compare. So now if we compare the tine spacing with wing tines versus what we looked at earlier, which was the tine spacing with standard Tilco tines with no wings on, here we have the tines spaced at 1.5 times their working depth. So again, we're working at 550 to 600 millimeters deep. We've got a spacing of 800 millimeters on the rank. Both tines have wings on. Now we can see that we're getting quite a bit more interaction between those two tines, between their spacing. So again, we've loosened soil now down to below half that working depth with those wing tines, whereas previously when we had no wings on those tines, this undisturbed area in the centre was almost at the surface of the soil. So we've definitely loosened a lot more soil here by having the wings on the tines, and allowed the tines to be spaced further apart. What we'll look at next is if we've actually got these tines spaced closer or further apart. Okay, so if we look at the tine spacing with wing tines, this profile pit is an excavation of the 1 times depth spacing. So we're working the tines at 550 to 600 millimeters deep, and we've got them spaced on the rank at 550 millimeters deep. Wide, 550 millimeters wide. So now you can see with a wing on the tine how much more loosened area we get. So if you remember from the tines working at 600 with no wings, we had at least half the soil between the tines that was not involved in interaction, so was not loosened. Here you can see that pretty much all that soil between the two tines has been loosened. We've got very little undisturbed soil in between that tine spacing with wings on. So these two tines set at this spacing obviously loosen significantly more soil than the tines without wings. And then we can compare this if we go to wider tine spacing. We'll see what happens in the other pits. So now if we move on and look at a treatment where the tines were spaced at 1.5 times their working depth, we can see the difference in interaction. So these are the Tilco tines working with a wing, working at between 550 and 600 millimeters deep, and they're spaced at about 800 to 850 on the toolbar, so they're 1.5 times working depth. Now we can see the interaction is starting to diminish from the single tine spacing, so we're ending up with an undisturbed area in between. I would say this is probably similar to the non-wing tines at their 1 tine spacing. So just by adding the wings, we can move our tines an extra 300 millimeters apart on the toolbar and loosen a similar area of soil. So compared with the single tine spacing with wings, we're obviously not loosening everything between the tines now, but we are doing a similar job to the unwinged tines at the standard spacing. So if we look next at what happens when we increase the spacing again, we can see what happens to the loosened area. Last treatment in this trial was the tines spaced at 2 times their depth of work. So these tines are spaced at 1100, working at between 550 and 600. These tines again working at 550, 600 deep with a wing. So you can see now that the interaction is pretty much gone. We're back to a similar scenario as we were with the tines without wings at 1.5 times spacing roughly. So that undisturbed section of soil in the surface, in the centre there, is coming quite close to the surface. So we've almost ended up here with the tines working independently, where they're loosening the area of soil that they would do if they were working individually, and a minimum amount of interaction between the tines. So probably saying here that this tine spacing, even with wings on, is getting to a situation where it's too wide because we're leaving too much undisturbed soil between those tines.